how far is too far, right? Especially in the area of dating, in boundaries.
Yeah.
What can I do physically in a relationship
Without crossing some sort of magical line.
without crossing the line into what's sinful?
Okay, what's
Right?
sinful? Yeah.
And so obviously, right, you guys aren't asking what I think. You guys aren't asking just what Kelly thinks. If we're talking about what's sinful, God is the only standard of that determines what's sinful and what isn't.
Right.
And so let's see what the Bible has to say kind of about this area. One, and Kelly was hitting this in our first question today, is that we believe God created sex to be enjoyed in marriage and only in marriage. Genesis 2:25 says Adam and his wife were both naked and they felt no shame, right? So nakedness, sex exists before anything goes wrong in the world, right?
Yep.
Genesis 3 is when it all
No
falls
shame.
apart.
It's all good.
And yet there they are, naked, no shame. I've had some friends put that on their wedding invitations, and I think it's hilarious because no one really looks it up. But if you do, that's a funny little Easter egg there. Hebrews 13, verse 4 in the New Testament says, marriage should be honored by all, and the marriage bed kept pure, for God will judge the adulterer and all the sexually immoral. And so the idea of sex staying in marriage, right, is this idea that in the safety of a loving, committed marriage, you have the freedom to experience sex as it was meant and designed to be, right? Something that binds the couple together, which you were talking about earlier, and is actually something that science has proven that all the chemicals that are released during sex bind you with someone else. Like it creates this impression in your mind. It's something that can, produce kids in an environment that is suited for them and set up for them, especially if it is that loving and committed marriage. And it's also something that's fun, right? And so this is something that God has designed to be enjoyed in its specific context, in the context of a healthy, committed, loving marriage where you're free to be yourself with your sexual partner without the fear that if you don't impress them or something goes wrong, that they're going to find something better, right?
So,
you know that they're with you for the long haul.
So you're essentially saying sex is for marriage. So if you're answering the question, how far is too far? The answer is sex.
Yeah, so
too far.
box number one, our
Sex
first kind
is
of
the
thing is like
furthest.
sex is off the table when you're
Sex-
dating
Yes.
until you're married.
Yes.
And that's God's design for you. As you were talking about earlier, like we need to be committed to how God has designed things to be because we understand that He is not just like this big God who wants to put rules on us.
He's
that
not a cosmic killjoy.
He's created things to work in a certain way, and that His way ends up leading to the best kind of life that we could be living.
And the best kind of society.
Yeah. Meanwhile, our world is going to tell you that, like, hey, sex isn't a big deal, so everyone should be able to get to do it. But also, sex is a huge deal. Why would you say that people shouldn't be able to do it? And so our world lives in this tension of like,
so good.
yeah, sex is, it's not a big deal, but it's a huge deal. Don't keep anything from it. And a lot of times, romance, sex is held up as like the number one path to happiness, when we believe that the real path to flourishing is following after God and being in a close relationship with Him, not just being in a physical relationship with each other. And so the first thing that we want to point out is that God's created sex for a purpose. It exists in marriage, and it's outside of His purpose for it to exist in dating. The second is that term that kind of shows up in Hebrews, in the Hebrews passage of sexual immorality. This is a term most often used in the New Testament to describe going against God's intentional good use of sex in marriage. The Greek word is actually porneia, and so I don't like to always bring up the Greek all the time, but that one I feel like sounds a little referential to something else that we might recognize. And it's this idea, it's wide-ranging meaning from everything from prostitution to sleeping with someone else's spouse. In one case, in the letters to the Corinthians, there's a man who's sleeping with his dad's wife, which I hope is his stepmom.
Right.
And that this idea of sexual immorality, of porneia, kind of covers all these ways that people deviate from God's intended purpose.
Right.
And we've been deviating, like the story of Genesis is like,
since Genesis
it's all
3.
over there. We have deviations from God's intended purpose. It's the story of humanity, that God made things one way and we decide to do things our own way, that we think our way is better than His way. And yet we experience the consequences of that constantly. Not just his judgment, but just even the natural consequences of doing things in the not healthiest, not wisest way, of treating something that was created for a purpose contrary to its purpose. And so all of that background is important because if you're going to draw the line between sexual immorality and doing life God's way, right? If you're going to draw that line and try to figure out what's sinful, well, it's important for us to realize that God's way is designed to be like the best way. That
Right.
he's not drawing lines to keep you from what's good. He's drawing lines to lead you to what is good.
Can I jump in real quick?
Absolutely.
The whole idea that mental shift between what God has for me is actually the best or actually the best good for me, it's really difficult because even from Genesis 3, the whole lie was, hey, what God has for you isn't good. He's keeping something from you. He's like Satan was like tempting Eve to say, hey, you know what God has for you is actually not as good as you thought.
Absolutely.
Your way is better. And we've been struggling mentally with that same type of battle ever since Genesis 3.
In so many areas, not just in the area of sex, right? And we'll
Absolutely.
see in one of our passages we're going to hit on in a little bit that sex is not the only area that God's standards aren't met by humanity.
Totally.
It's a huge topic of conversation in our culture. It's sort of a countercultural position that the church tends to hold, but it's not the only place that humans go against God's design. It's just
Absolutely.
one of many. But with the question of how far is too far, like I'm anticipating that whoever's asking that question has a desire somewhere in there to do things God's way.
Right.
That they either recognize that it's good or it's right, or they want to follow what God has to say. And so they really legitimately want to know what he has to say. If that's not you, right? If you're listening to us or watching us on YouTube and that's not where you're at yet, you're more than welcome to hear this conversation and to listen in, but it's really designed for someone who's already committed to this idea of doing life God's way and is having trouble figuring out the mess of that. But we just want to lay out the case just in the beginning that like God has a purpose for why he set sex up to be the way that it is. And we can either live according to that purpose or we can try to do things our own way.
Totally.
But we want to be people who are committed to doing things God's way because we believe that it's good and that he is good.
Yeah. And it's beneficial for a flourishing society. I mean, it really is. I mean, I'm reading through the Old Testament like I do every year, and you see all these laws that don't necessarily feel like they apply to us today. But if you think about it, like they didn't have any direction on how to live in the desert or how to have like appropriate sexual relationships, especially when you're coming out of a society that, sacrificed babies and slept with, had a lot of ancestral like conflict. And so when God was setting up these laws and regulations, it really did promote the best possible chance for the flourishing of the nation of Israel. And if it wasn't for some of those rules or regulations, there would not be the nation of Israel today. And I think similar with us today is that God is actually setting us up in his word so that there can be the best possible chance of a flourishing both morally and cultural.
Absolutely.
Culture and moral and cultural, flourishment, whatever those words are.
And so if we were to sum up so far, right, we believe God created sex to be enjoyed in marriage, and then that's the sandbox, that's the playground for sex, is that loving, committed, healthy marriage. And the second thing is that sexual sin isn't about accidentally making God mad. It's not just about arbitrary rules that he set up. It's about his leading us to what is really and actually good. And so we want to do what is sexually moral and not what's sexually immoral because we want God's version of what is good. As a quick sidebar, too, I think it's important to know as we start getting closer to talking about specific boundaries in dating, that, man, it's possible to sin sexually without even touching someone else, right? I think we usually think of boundaries as like, can I touch Kelly's hand? Is that weird? Can I touch his wrist, his elbow? Too far, right? We start thinking about physical touch because we tend to think of sex as a physical activity. But man, like Jesus lays it out that like sexual sin starts not just on the physical line, it starts at the heart level.
Absolutely.
And in Matthew 5, Jesus says, you've heard that it was said you shouldn't commit adultery, but I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. Right? And the idea being that we can, in our heart, decide that sin is good before we ever move towards doing something physically, and that Jesus' picture for our life isn't that we would have a rule book that we are forcing ourselves to follow, but that it would be that we're people who have a heart that beats like his heart, that really, truly love what is good, that we love the idea of sex in its rightful place, not as the pinnacle of what leads us to happiness, not as the best thing in the world, not the thing that leads us to human flourishing, but a created good that God has made to benefit a marriage and a family.
So yeah, so what would you say, like, so how can somebody sin or cross the line without physically touching somebody else?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's any point that in your heart, right, you want to do something sexual with someone.
Yeah, so if you are having sex with another person in your mind,
And
like,
I think
you've already crossed the line.
I think especially it's that like heart line, right? Because there are going to be times where thoughts, temptations occur to you, right? You're flipping through channels, something comes up, you're scrolling through Reddit, and an ad comes up.
You don't have a decision in that. It just
you're just laying there in bed and just like bam, like the thought is there. But it's that moment that you choose to dwell on it. The moment you choose to take satisfaction from it, or start like feeling like
hold
this
on
is
to
a
that
good
for a little bit
thing.
longer.
Yes.
Yeah.
Like that. Then that's where we're starting to cross that line, even with our own heart, or in a dating relationship, right? It's when we, in our heart, start cultivating these desires for our partner of like, man, how great would it be if we could just like, oh man, what if Jesus just gave me a pass just for one day, right? What if for one day I could just pretend like we're married, or like, oh man, and 6 years from now when we're married, the things that we're gonna do, like those are things where we're starting in our heart to get ahead of where we are living right now,
Right.
And so I think. I just want to share some practical boundaries, right? Because I think we can talk about what the Bible says. We talk about these big concept things of porneia and what leads to flourishing and stuff like that. But man, where would we draw the boundaries? And so I'm gonna talk about some boundaries. That some of these are just even things that I wish someone had shared with me early in my life. And so I think the first one is don't do anything that turns you on. Don't do anything in your relationship that turns you on. Don't do anything that gets the engine started, that starts moving you towards that marriage zone, the sex zone, right? Don't start playing on the edge of the sandbox. Don't
do anything that leads to arousal or excitement in a sexual way at all.
And that's going to be different things for different people, right? And so I think that's important to clarify. But I think one thing that I wish. Right, that's probably a no-no. That's something I wish that people had said to me. I wish someone had the courage to say to me, because I don't think I would have wanted to hear it when I was dating. I think making out really probably sets you up for more problems than it does benefit.
Yeah.
Because what making out does is it's starting that early initial process of having sex with someone, and it starts those processes going biologically for you that are leading you down towards that road.
And so like when it comes to making out, you would say it's better to not start.
Yeah. Now, am I standing in judgment of someone who's made out, saying like, oh well, you basically have had sex with someone? Like that's not the point.
No.
But the point is to say like, man, if we want to live wise lives that value God's way as good, not as these boundaries that are keeping us down, like we need to look at the things that get our engine going sexually, and consider drawing the line on those things. The second, I think, when it comes to areas of touch, right? Like what's it safe to touch? What's it not safe to touch? I think when you're dating before you're married, the fastest way to draw the line emotionally, right, is only touch your partner, only touch the person you're dating, places that it wouldn't be weird for your parents to touch you.
Wow.
Now that's very uncomfortable because we very quickly start imagining what that would be like. We're like, whoa, but the truth is, if you're dating someone and you're not married, you don't have any special rights to their body, and they don't have any special rights to you. And so you should be touching each other respectfully in ways that other people who aren't married to that person can also touch them. And so I think that gives a good picture of sort of where we would draw the line of what's okay and what's not okay. Does that mean that you can't hold hands? Like, no, I think you can hold hands. Like, would it be strange to see a son walking down the street holding his dad's hand if they're, both, 20 and older? I guess if they're both 20, it's a little weird, but that'd be weird. But it also
some cultures it's fine.
Yes, and it's not something that's making you hyper uncomfortable. That's not something that's like, ooh, that's really like weird that my dad grabbed my hand.
No.
And so I think like this just gives us a picture without me getting out a diagram and starting
Right.
like drawing pictures on zones.
Yeah.
And talking about like bathing suit areas, and then you have to figure out what kind of bathing suit. Is it a sporty swimsuit? Is it something that you're lounging out and tanning in? Like, but if we're just talking about areas, like, man, it'd be weird to have your mom put her hand on your tummy, right? And so
Right.
it's probably not like a great idea when
Yes.
you're dating to like get used to touching areas like that, where that are traditionally not thought of as sexual areas, but they are close enough to it that we don't really want
Right.
like other people who are in non-married relationships with us
That's great.
touching us there. And so then the third kind of area that I think is also a really important wise boundary for us to draw is don't spend all your time or share your deepest secrets right off the bat. In other words, don't treat the person on a heart level like you're married before you're ready to treat them on a physical level like you're married.
Mm-hmm.
Because when you share your deepest parts of your life, and when you spend all your time exclusively with one person, the other area of your life that's going to want to catch up to those two areas is the physical touch, right? You're going to just be drawn more and more to want to touch that person. Now, obviously, when you're dating, it's good to talk about things that are important. You want to talk about direction for life. You want to talk about things that are like, what kind of people do we want to be? If we were to get married, how would we want to live? Like, what's important to you? What's important to me?
Right.
But you want to get there at a pace that is respectable.
Absolutely.
Right? You don't want to find yourself now totally giving your heart over to someone else who in 3 weeks, 4 months from now has the freedom to decide, like, you know what, this isn't the relationship for
Right.
me. You don't want to hide yourself so much that you never really get to find out about each other, but you want to be careful and wise and slow at how deep you get to that level of emotional intimacy.
Wow, just to sum this up. So some of the boundaries that you recommended, which I think are amazing, you call them boundaries, I call them guardrails. They're just small, like little guidelines to keep you from colliding with sin, which, again, nothing inherently these are not inherently sin. Like if you spend too much time with somebody, or if you run into somebody and you accidentally touch their stomach, like
Yeah.
like
It's saving someone from falling out of a boat and
like, oh man, like drop them. These are not inherently sin, but these are boundaries or guidelines or guardrails that will promote the type of relationship we want. So number one, you said, hey, don't put yourself in a situation both visually or physically where you are purposely allowing yourself to get turned on, or you're turning on the other person, and we're referring to sexual arousal. And number two, you say, hey, don't touch areas that you wouldn't want your mom to touch, like you.
Yes, which is a very uncomfortable way to word it.
And it's very
but
clear.
really paints the picture.
Very clear. And then third, don't feel or don't spend all of your time with your person. You need to spare your heart from the potential heartbreak that would ensue from the relationship either severing, but most importantly, your body is going to want to catch up to wherever your heart is as well. And especially if you're young and you don't see yourself getting married anytime soon, you definitely want to create that space. So
Absolutely. And I think really what that comes down to is that sometimes this question, we ask it for the wrong reasons, because what we're asking is, how close can I get to sin?
right.
But our attitude towards sin should be that sin is death. Sin is evil.
Yes.
Like, I don't want to get close to sin. I want to get as close to God's way as possible. 1
Right.
Corinthians 6:18 says, flee from sexual immorality. All other sins a person commits are outside their body, but whoever sins sexually sins against their own body. Or Ephesians 5:3 says, but among you there must not be even a hint of sexual immorality or of any kind of impurity or of greed, which I think is important to throw in there, right? That's not just sex that we're supposed to stay away from. It says because these are improper for God's holy people, right? But so we want to be people who are striving to not have even a hint of sexual immorality,
Right.
not like getting as close to the line as we can. And it's good to know what that line is. And it's good to know what God's design is. But we want to be people who so believe that God is good and that his way is going to lead us to the best way.
Absolutely.
That we want to be so committed to that we're not worried about how close we can get to living like the world lives. We want to be people who are looking for ways to do life and do dating relationships, which are difficult, messy, and not what we're designed for, to do those in a wise way to set us up for healthy, lasting marriages.
Absolutely. Well said. Well said.